I'm Mark Brumley, and I'm with Fran Maier, author of True Confessions, among other things. Fran is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Recently, Fran, I was talking to your colleague, George Weigel, and I was referring to it as the swamp. But I was saying that we're talking about a bigger swamp, which the Catholic Church isn't exactly the bigger swamp, but there's a lot of swamp work. I want to tell people a little bit more about you. You served for some 25 years, I think, as the special assistant to Archbishop Chaput, both when he was in Denver and when he was in Philadelphia. Older people may recognize you as the former editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register.
Yeah, back when dinosaurs walked the earth, yeah.
That's right. And before that, you were involved with various nefarious things in Hollywood, some of which we may hear a little bit about in the course of this discussion. But we're here to talk about this interregnum and the future, the interregnum between Pope Francis and the future. The Conclave is coming up. And I would be delighted to hear your thoughts, maybe, if I'm not mixing my metaphors here, filtered through the lens of your book, True Confessions. So first, let's begin by talking a little bit about that book and what your purpose was in writing it, and then we'll get on to the conclave.
Well, the reason that I wrote it was not because I could, for one thing. You know, I knew a lot. I knew a lot about the internal workings of the church from all of the years of diocesan service that I had, and particularly the senior years when I was working for Archbishop Chaput directly as his senior aide. So I could do it, which raised the issue of, well, do I do a book where I have my opinion about everything, or do I actually do the research of finding out what other people might think, which is kind of a novel idea when you're a talking head. But I just had the instinct that two things. That number one, there's a real temptation to be stressed by the times that we live in, and yet there's also an invitation to a lot of legitimate hope in terms of the health of the church. I think in the United States, particularly, I can't speak for other areas really, but in the U.S., I think there's an awfully lot more positive energy than we allow ourselves to believe. The challenges are serious and they're obvious. The positive elements, the things that are really sources of hope, are less obvious because there's an instinct in human nature to be miserable.
Right. And to take delight in our misery.
Yeah. There's a pleasure in feeling lousy in a way. And I give into it myself, but I know a lot of apostolates and leaders of apostolates and good priests. And I just wanted an opportunity to investigate that. So, Mark, you know the architecture of the book really well. I mean, I interviewed 103 people, extensive interviews of 103 people over a 17-month period, 30 bishops from 25 different states and a couple of different countries, and then a lot of lay people, religious deacons. And I came away from that with two things, both of which give me a lot of hope. One of them was that there was a fidelity that allowed a real candor about what's right and wrong in the church. It's easy to have kind of a syrupy, pious affection and loyalty to the church, but nobody really believes that because we live in a turbulent time. The people that I interviewed genuinely love the church. I mean, they're faithful, they practice, they take the faith and its teachings seriously, but they're also grown-up people who know reality from their families and from their diocesan and pastoral service, and they were frank in their criticism of what's wrong. But beyond that, the dominant feeling of the book was just this profound love of the church. And that was really, I think, quite moving because I kind of expected it, but when you encounter it in real people, it's just fabulous. And, part of the title, part of the title is the fact that I really love the movie.
That's right. So I was going to ask you to explain the title.
I would really, I really encourage people to see the movie, which is a tough movie, but it's profoundly Catholic. The story of the priest in that movie is really quite moving. But then there's another reason too. And we're all supposed to be confessors of the faith. some of us might be martyrs. Nobody really wants to be,
Right.
but we live in a martyring age because
we like the definition of witness that isn't so much bound to martyrdom, right?
yeah, but we're all supposed to be confessors. So True Confessions is partly my nod to the movie that I love, but more importantly, the fact that you've got 103 people confessing their faith in a really authentic fashion, because the love is always connected to truth, and the honesty of these people combined with their fidelity was just really powerful. And I think it succeeded, Mark, because I was just with a group of priests this week giving a couple of talks, and one or two of them came up to me and said exactly what I just told you in terms of their impressions of the book. They believed it because it sounded real from their own experience, and they were lifted up by reading it. So I hope people will read it.
I think most of us, we like to hear positive things, but when we're experiencing the negative, there's a certain delight, I guess you could say, in a certain way, we take when we hear somebody speaking the truth, and we know that's the truth, and I feel like, oh, well, this person is credible. There's this whole line from, I think it's Gadamer Spez, talking about the church as being an expert in humanity. Now, what that means is we can identify well the problems as well as the opportunities. And when somebody does that, and says, here's a problem, and gets it right, that person has credibility when it comes to what he's proposing as solutions or signs of hope or things of that sort. So that's dead on what I find in your book. You get it right, both in terms of here are some problems and here are some things that are good happening in the church.
Yeah, the women in the book, the men are really quite articulate too, but the lay women that I interviewed were just spectacular. They're just really, they have this kind of maternal, they're not all mothers, but most of them are. They're scholars and mothers and wives, and they just have a beautiful feminine love for the church that I found really extremely articulate. The other thing that I really love from personal experience, and I'm sure you will resonate with this, when we talk about Christian obedience, there's this idea that, well, we just do whatever we're told in the church, If you're on the outside of the church looking in, it's like, well, these are all mindless people who just do what the church tells them. Number one, church life isn't like that at all, as you very well know. Obedience in the church, and Archbishop Chaput talked about this too. Obedience in the church is very much like the mutual obedience of a good marriage. You're faithful to the other person. You put the other person first. But a good marriage and a good life in the church has a lot of honesty in it. And I've noticed I've been married 54 years. I love my wife very much, and she loves me very much, or she wouldn't stick around. But she's never had any problem being exquisitely clear about what I'm doing wrong. That's just a healthy human relationship. And we have to love the church. We have to have a humility. We have to assume the goodwill of legitimate authority. But we also have to be alert to error and the people we love going down the wrong road, the institutions we love going down the wrong road. And we have to respectfully but firmly bring that up, because that's truth. Love is always grounded in truth, right? So,
that's right.
We just have to express the truth in a respectful way.
Well, here we are in this interregnum period between Pope Francis and, as I say, the future of the conclave hasn't started yet. What would you take from your book as sort of what we should keep in mind looking towards the future, looking towards the next pontificate?
Wow. Well, I would like to see, and I may have written this, I really want to see a simplicity and a strong intellect in the next pope. It's being a scholar is fine. I think the popes. I've been alive for 76 years now. So I can remember as a kid Pius XII. And I think part of the dissonance of the current moment is that, from Pius XII through Ratzinger, we had A, great scholarship, and B, an experience of the big ideological struggles of the early 20th century. Along comes Francis, who comes out of a very different environment and was only 28 when the council ended, had no role in it. And so there's bound to be this kind of apparent disconnect between Francis and his predecessors. Some of that's real and some of it's perception. But I think the strength of Francis was his emphasis on simplicity, and realism in terms of the church's role in the world. It's not a world power. The church is not, in the 19th century anymore. He was strong in reminding us that Christendom is over. And we have different challenges now. But I think a return to the really strong, articulate, intellectual tradition of the church is something that I would really hope for in the next pope, because we're dealing with, you've heard me say this many times, I'm sure, but, we really are living through a kind of new Reformation.
Right.
And I mean Reformation in the sense of reformation of the way that we think about ourselves and the world. And we need somebody with the intellectual gifts and the memory, the cultural memory to engage that without arrogance. And so I'm hoping that the conclave will produce somebody like that,
Okay, so you say that. I know a lot of people will hear that saying, well, why do we need an egghead pope?
We don't need an egghead pope. We need a strong intellect. If he comes across as an egghead, he'll fail, because he has to be accessible to people, But John Paul, for example, was enormously accessible, and had a great sense of humor and a wonder. I mean, he was an actor,
Right.
But he had this tremendous intellect and this tremendous experience of life from the, very difficult circumstances that he emerged from. So that's another factor, and I think, Archbishop Shappy said this just in an interview that hasn't come out yet, but I saw an early copy of it. I mean, he said, we're looking for somebody with a strong intellect, but somebody who has that tempered by personal sacrifice or personal suffering in some way. Because that,
so it's not just intellectual abstraction, but it's
No.
rooted in experience and suffering. Yeah.
And it also connects you to ordinary people, because
Right.
everybody has the experience of suffering and the need to make personal sacrifice, So, I think that's pretty much what I would say. I would
When
hope
we were
that.
talking earlier, you said, focus on really what the papacy is all about, and you summarized that very well in terms of discipleship and following Jesus. You talk about intellect and simplicity and suffering, but I know that for you, that discipleship piece of it is central. And we might, on a certain level, think it's just a given. But there are, as you know, because you've got a lot of experience working in the church, there are a lot of people who are baptized and identify as Catholic, and even clergy, where either they don't really know the Lord or they don't really know Him well. So
Well, I think
that may
working
shock people, but that's reality.
No, that's very much reality. I think working for the church is its own particular kind of temptation not to believe, because you get so wrapped up in structures and institutions and conflicts and policies that you forget what the whole thing is about. And that's one of my concerns, Mark. We were talking about this before we started, but it's one of my concerns about the conclave. On one level, it's really almost exhausting to read these hundreds of opinions and articles and bickering and all this stuff. And most of the people who are doing these things really don't know what's going on, because you can't.
Right.
But it does create this kind of kingdom of noise and that just wears everybody out and gets people miserable. I mean, we have to remember that this whole operation for the last 2,000 years has been about one person. And if you don't have a relationship with that person and cultivate it on a daily basis, pretty soon you're not going to believe in him. It'll be a nice myth or an important ethical system, but it won't be the supernatural intimacy that you are supposed to have with God. And I mean, that's a big concern for me because frequently, C.S. Lewis wrote about this. C.S. Lewis said that the most dangerous time for an apologist is right after he's articulately defended a
That's right.
belief, you know?
That's right.
Why? Because you've emptied yourself out and there's nothing left in there. And you can step back and say, did I really believe what I just said? Because it all seems like dry straw.
Right.
I begin to understand why Aquinas burned a lot of his final texts.
That's exactly.
That's right. Because it's dangerous. It's really dangerous. And all this noise, man. I just, on one level, you know, I'm going to Rome, to cover the conclave.
There you go. You're going to contribute to the noise, friend?
That's exactly right. You know, by the way, I'll be helping George Weigel, and the joke that I love to tell him is that he's the distinguished senior fellow of Catholic Studies. I'm the somewhat less distinguished fellow, but I hope still pretty good. You know,
yeah, you're great. So you're going over to Rome, and you're going to add to the noise by adding to George's noise, or helping George add noise. Okay, very good.
I'll be doing both actually. I'm kind of a hired gun. So, but
if they call you into the conclave unexpectedly and say you've been elected, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know who I
don't know what Sue-Ann would think about it, but
yeah, I think she'd frown on that. But yeah, it's I want somebody. My impressions, for example, of Bishop Eric Varden, who has no chance of being elected pope because he's, you know, in Norway and he's a bishop. He's not a cardinal, but there are qualities to his style of leadership that I think are something that we really ought to examine very carefully. I mean, he's, pardon me, one second. He's, you know, he's an intellectual in the sense that he, you know, I think went to Cambridge or Oxford. I forget what.
Right.
He's a monk, you know, because he was a monk for years. And yet now he's a pastor in a completely post-Christian environment. You know, and he is a beautiful writer. I mean, an absolutely beautiful speaker and writer. I mean, a really convicted person. Now, I don't want to talk him up too much because, you know, he's probably stuck in Norway for the duration. But
well, God bless Norway.
God bless Norway. But it's that kind of man that we need.
Right.
You know, a good balance of the different things that being a Catholic pastoral leader can communicate.
I was in communication with Tim Gray. I'm going to be speaking at the Augustine Institute in a week or so, and I told Tim, you know, this is a great opportunity to talk about your book on Peter. You know, and he said, "Well, we're not talking about the papacy. You know, this is the papacy we're talking about." And I said, "Well, yeah, but it's Peter. You know, Peter's the place we begin with this because Peter's the guy that Jesus picked. He's the first in the line, and for all of his foibles, you know, he is a kind of model." And you just kind of wonder, because we have, you know, Jesus knew a young Peter, right? Peter lived his life and died a martyr as an old man, but we have this model of old popes, and I'm not pushing for a young person necessarily. We have this image of old popes and old institutions and all of that. And sometimes it seems like the vitality of a man who has a deep relationship with the Lord, and that governs his life, and he's not so much structured by patterns of, you know, establishment and all of that. Not that those things are unimportant, but the idea of someone who starts with his personal discipleship with the Lord and then goes back to let that inform how he deals with these structures.
Yeah.
It's really hard to think about that. When I'm looking at the list of the cardinal electors, and some of these men I know, and they're good men and holy men and all of that, but it's a distant image from that image of Peter, you know? So.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that American Catholics are bad at is history. I mean, it's not just American Catholics; it's Americans in general.
Right.
Don't like history because the whole the whole principle of the United States is a new order of the ages, and so history is bad, you know. But for us as a believing people, it's really, really important to know our history. And if we know our history, you know, that role of Peter has been inhabited by all sorts of different men. I think you know, more than 80 of the former popes, 265 popes or 266, I guess, whatever the number is.
I think it's 267, but yeah.
Yeah. So we've got 80 popes that are venerated as saints. We've got maybe a dozen popes that were really bad guys. I mean, morally corrupt guys. But most guys are just committed men who try to do their best in a very tough job and then fade into history. And so, what's the lesson to draw from that? Despite everything that's gone on over the last 2 years, here we are having this conversation today, and the church is still alive. So if you have that attitude, then Peter becomes, well, anyway, Peter is put in perspective. You know, when I think about Francis, I think one of the contributions Francis made was to get out of the way the turbulence of going from a generation that lived Vatican II, wrote Vatican II, and worked to incarnate it in the life of the church, and someone who comes along and is Pope and wasn't connected to that at all. I mean, there's a certain turbulence in that because there's a natural disconnection in terms of experience behind the way that you're leading. The next man will be free of that on some level, and hopefully,
yeah, of course, he may not have even been born.
Yeah, and that
at the time of the council.
I think having a younger man would certainly be good for that reason. You know, I mean, we've moved into the genuinely post-conciliar period where that's just one among many councils, and we have to imbibe the entire body of church teaching over a very long period of time. How do you live that now? I mean, I'm excited by some of the African bishops, for example. You know, I mean, they just believe. That's right. I spent in my previous lifetime as National Catholic Register editor, I did work as a journalist in Africa 3 times, and you know, you could go to Mass in Africa and be in Mass for 2 hours.
That's right. It's not a quickie.
No, but you don't experience it as, gee, when's this going to end? I mean, it's just exhilarating. So it's a completely different experience of the faith in a place like Africa from a place like, you know, the United States, where, hey, Father's, you know, going 15 minutes on this homily and I really got to get out of here. I mean,
that's right.
It's a different experience. We need that. We need somebody who's just excited about the faith, alive in it, and is able to make it come alive for people who think they've experienced it, but really haven't.
We have a priest from Africa in our parish, and he tells us the story about, you know, he talks about short homilies in the United States, and he says how, you know, they really have to preach it up, you know, from in Kenya, which is where he's from, because sometimes people will come long distances for Mass.
Yeah.
So they expect this to be worth their time. A 15-minute thing. I've walked an hour and I'm here for 15 minutes. No, or a 15-minute homily or a half hour. No, it's got to be a robust presentation and celebration of Holy Mass. So, at any rate, that's coincides with your point there. You know, it's interesting that here we are. We were 25 years into the 21st century, right? And so much of the discussion still is about what happened after 1965 in the church. I think you're right that we have the opportunity not to move beyond it, but to kind of fully to treat the council, the Second Vatican Council, as you say, as one of many councils. This is the most recent one, but one of many. But it does raise this question. You know, I'm definitely a man of the council. I teach this Vatican II. I believe it has a continuing pertinence to us. I completely agree with what Pope Benedict XVI said about it towards the end of his life and what he said at the very outset of his pontificate. So I'm not setting it aside or trying to marginalize it at all, but we are in a different time where people are more willing to think through that post-conciliar era and do something different. I think that's part of what's behind some of the traditionalism that we're seeing, a resurgence that we're seeing there. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, but I think that's part of it. Again, without wanting to get into a whole lot of Pope Francis, he took a particular approach to this emerging or re-emerging traditionalism. Where do you think the church needs to go with respect to that in the future?
I think the most important issue facing us is anthropological.
Oh,
And what I mean by that is just who are we as a human being? You know, I know that I think it was in the 2015 synod, maybe the 2018 too, when Archbishop Chaput was a delegate. I guess it was the 2015 synod. He was elected to the permanent synod council at that point, and he was asked to list possible topics for discussion, and he suggested Psalm 8 because it raises the issue, who is man, that you would create this amazing creature God, and that's the central question, particularly facing AI right now.
Right.
And the whole transgender weirdness that's going on. Who is man? And why are we different from the animals? What gives us our dignity? So, I mean, I think that's a central issue. But I want to go back to this idea of the reformation of society, this idea that we're in a second, a new Reformation, because there's no rest from it, and people need to understand that. Well, certainly for the rest of my lifetime, which is not probably on a short wick, but I think for the next 25 years, you're going to have a lot of turmoil, and it's easy during that period to before there's some sort of new stability that comes into the world one way or the other, it's very easy to feel that God isn't there because there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. But this is exactly the right time to be a Christian. I mean, you just have to cultivate the faith so it's strong, because right now, I mean, for example, with Ignatius Press, thanks be to God, it exists because there's an outlet for good work that allows people to be better informed, and where am I going with that? Where I'm going with it is that there's an opportunity to really make a difference if you commit yourself to the work now in a way that didn't really matter quite as much in easier periods. It was easy to be pious when everything worked pretty well.
That's right.
When everything's broken, it's a lot harder, but it's also a lot more powerful because it's the seeds of renewal, And I think, again, like where we started, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons to take heart. I mean, I could list, Father Fessio always makes the point, look, there are 500 radio or 600 radio stations in this country that are really solidly Catholic. We've got EWTN, we've got Ignatius Press, we've got Catholic Leadership Institute. We got
a lot of other Catholic publishing companies now that are doing really good things.
Really good work, and so why are we depressed? Well, we're depressed because you don't hear about that. You're not going to see that on even on Fox News unless there's some disaster that they want a faithful Catholic voice on. Certainly not going to see it on MSNBC or CNN. And so people have to consciously go to the sources that are reliably, faithfully Catholic in order to be fed. And the other thing too, I'm a broken record on this, but you got to read Scripture. You got to spend time in adoration. That's really a powerful tool. And personal confession, that gives me an opportunity to plug the book, by the way.
There you go.
Yeah. I remember interviewing one of the priests. You might remember this. This is a priest who is running the restructuring of parishes in a diocese, a big diocese in the East, which is a horrible job because everybody's angry. The parishioners are angry. The pastors are upset. You're dealing with lawyers and finance officers and all this other stuff. So I asked him, well, Father, if you had just one or two things to really set the church on the path to renewal, what would they be? He didn't even hesitate a second. He said, personal confession and adoration. If you do those two things, enough people do them loyally over time, that fixes the problem. I mean, I just couldn't,
That's right.
it seems so absurdly simple and ineffective, but that's the beginning of turning things around, is your
Well, it's sort of
personal
Jesus's
reform.
message.
Yeah.
Jesus's message is repent and believe the good news. Repent, turn from your sin and yourself, and turn towards what God is doing in his kingdom. And of course, adoration is the essence of that. And we have the Eucharistic Lord present and all
Who's
of
one of
that.
my models is Václav Benda. Václav Benda was a friend of Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia during the Soviet period. He's less well known, but he did a lot of writing. And unlike Havel, Benda was a serious religious believer and particularly a very faithful Catholic. And he just, his attitude was, you start a revolution by changing yourself, you know. And I think I'll give you an example. He spent 4 years in prison for his political activity. Comes out of prison. One of the first things he does is not write an essay on the Gulag or on, political reform of Czechoslovakia. One of the first things he does is write a beautiful essay defending church teaching on contraception and abortion. I mean,
it's not obvious that you would start there.
No, but that's the intensity of the guy's faith and his family's faith. And that, that's why people remember him. I mean, the people who seek him out and read his work are very, very. It's a powerful experience, and that contributed to the reform.
So you talk about one of the issues we have to address is anthropology. Then you're speaking of here on the very basic level is personal conversion. That has to be a focal point of the next pope. He's got to call us to personal conversion. Are there other things that you would point to, needs in the church, needs in society, that the next pope should be about addressing?
I'm not competent to.
You better get up to speed, because the College of Cardinals is going to meet.
Yeah,
and they're going to ask you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm on their short list of consultants. No, I think in the American environment, one of the most important things we can do is separate ourselves from the emerging culture. I mean, Americans have put a very heavy emphasis on assimilating, especially since John Kennedy. And I think that was a mistaken idea because we took it too far. And one of the images that I use all the time is the fact that, we assimilated so well that we got digested and our beliefs got bleached out. So we're really no different from anybody else, on a global level. So that's a very big thing for me. I mean, I think we need to really consciously separate ourselves from an excessive and inappropriate kind of patriotism. The other thing too is that we need to get our head around the idea that the traditional centers of the Catholic faith and Christianity in general are essentially dead now. Europe is in I'm thinking particularly of it, and there's going to be a new kind of expression of the faith based in places like Africa and Latin America and Asia. I'm hoping Africa and Asia are more prominent than Latin America. There are wonderful movements in Latin America, but Latin America also has the dominant experience of a church-state integration that just doesn't work anymore and is, in fact, really a bad thing.
Talk a little bit about that so people understand, because a lot of the younger people may not get the reference.
Well, the United States is kind of a weird animal because we never were an established church here in the United States. And even at the very beginning, when we were kind of a despised minority, the government still really did an amazingly positive job of allowing us to exist and grow, but we were never part of the machinery. Latin America had exactly the opposite experience. It came out of a European model of altar and throne that had a very close relationship between the church and the state. And there's some advantages to that, obviously, particularly at the beginning of a period of evangelization. But what happens is that the state always comes out on top. The church becomes sort of, the state in religious garb. And
the department of the state.
Yeah. And ultimately, people rebel against that. I'm going to give you a perfect example, even a place like Philadelphia, where we weren't, officially connected to the political machinery, but it's a very Catholic environment. Certainly 100 years ago, and the church developed a lot of cultural power, and that gets you fat and lazy, and a little
Sometimes
arrogant.
corrupt.
Yeah, yeah, and people sooner or later it blows back on you, and when we arrived in Philadelphia, when the Archbishop arrived in Philadelphia to do a lot of cleanup work, part of the cleanup was that anger at the church for behaving in a way that was inappropriate, and exploitative on some level. So I'm hoping that, it'd be wonderful if tomorrow Germany woke up and suddenly decided to become Catholic again,
Right.
the German church. But it's not going to happen because people have a very hard time facing their mistakes and changing them. So that's why a while back in the interview, I talked about Africa, because some of the leaders there are both poor and on fire with the faith. And that's a wonderful model.
Good combination. It's the sort of poverty, the sort of poverty that Francis talked about when he said he wanted a poor church.
Yeah, I think he was correct that. I mean, you see it in the United States now. Historically, we've been whether you're Catholic or not, we've been a very religious country.
Yes.
And that's fading as we have become accustomed to wealth and power. Because we don't seem to need God. I mean, we've created the most intensely materialistic culture in history. And it's not so much that we attack God like the big ideological systems did of the last century. We just render him irrelevant by this massive tsunami of consumer appetites and
self-help programs and things of that sort.
So I mean, sure, yeah, I believe in God, but hey, I don't have time for him right now because blah blah blah, and that's even more effective in its atheism. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think, because we are seeing something of a religious resurgence. I'm curious whether you see a tendency on the part of many people who are part of that resurgence is kind of a understanding Christianity in a very culturally comfortable way. Because it's one thing to say I believe in God. It's another thing to say it's like the old God is on my side as opposed to I'm on God's side.
Yeah, I think a lot of people. Well, first of all, I think a new Gen Z, for example, the resurgence there to the degree there has been a resurgence, is they have nothing. They're looking for some kind of stability and memory that grounds them in a way that they can grow up in a healthy manner. So where does the church fit in there? Well, it's a life jacket. I mean, it's floating around there on the ocean, and they can grab onto it, and they get something. They get something alive out of it, and that I'm not criticizing that because that can very easily lead to a deeper conversion. But I don't know. I don't know how effective that's going to be. You can tell that I'm ambivalent about these things, because on the one hand, at the beginning of this interview, I was talking about how there's this huge energy still in the church in the United States that's very positive, which is true. And what's also true is this intensely materialistic culture that tends to suck out the energy from people who become entangled with it. I don't know where that's going to end.
All right. Well, let me go in a little different direction. We talked a little bit about the need for the next pope to be a man of the Lord, a man of the church, and some of the various issues that are out there. One of the topics that always comes up is when we talk about the future of the papacy, and this resonates in the secular world too, the role of politics in this, political alignment. We used to have the East-West political alignment, and people watched the papacy very carefully to see how that would unfold. We don't have that anymore. We have a different world. And I'm curious what you think about the direction church leadership needs to go to properly engage the world of really the multipolar world that we're in when it comes to politics?
Yeah, it'd be great if you asked me a harder question.
Yeah. Well, while you're answering, I'll see if I can think of a harder one.
I was of two minds about the papacy, this papacy's outreach to China.
Yes.
I think finally it's a mistake, because I think the Vatican has underestimated the intelligence and the resilience and the determination of the Chinese Communist Party. But I understand it, because I think the Holy See has an excellent record of just playing the long game. And I suspect that in addition to Francis not liking the United States, he has a memory of the Jesuit past in China. And also, it's probably an assessment that in the long run, China's the rising power and the United States has peaked and may be in decline. So I think you're going to see whether that's the correct policy right now. I mean, Cardinal Zen would say absolutely it's wrong,
right.
And I think he's actually correct. But
we published his book on that point. Not to be anti-Francis, but here's somebody
anti-Francis.
Here's someone on the ground who has a perspective. So.
Yeah, I mean, look, the political dimension of the papacy has always been there. You had during the Reformation period, you had popes that were, pro France or pro, Holy Roman Empire, or
some that were under the control of the French monarchy.
Right. Yeah, you're never going to get completely. The church is in the world and has to work in the world. Therefore, there will always be politics involved with religion, and it's always going to, on some level, be a mess. I completely understand. I completely understand Francis's dislike of the United States. I think it's regrettable, but if you're a Latin American, there's plenty of reason to dislike, U.S. policy in Latin America. Whether they're right or wrong, we'll put that aside. But I mean, it's definitely a legitimate point of view.
Yeah.
What I had a really hard time with during the Francis pontificate was his distrust of the American church and American Catholic life, because I think there's no national Catholic community in the world with more generosity and more life than the United States. The bishops that I've met, and I've met and worked with a great deal, a great many of them. They're just terrific men, and I don't think they were appropriately appreciated.
A lot of people feel like Pope Francis simply misunderstood the American church.
No, I think he understood it. He just didn't like it.
Okay.
And that's, hey, that's life. But it's regrettable.
We don't always like everybody we have to work with.
Yeah. But, it's that was, so we get back to this this ambivalence, on the one hand, I don't know a church in the world that's more generous and more consistently well organized in projecting that generosity than the American Catholic Church. And yet we're part of a culture that seeps into the church that's intensely materialistic.
Right.
So it's
and we're what is it, 8% or 9% of the church or something like that worldwide, and we have a lot of economic clout, a lot of political clout, and all of that. And you can see, especially in Latin America, why someone would resent that or might resent that, whether it's conscious and explicit or unconscious or implicit or somewhere in between. And you can see a similar thing. I don't think there's, despite the history of colonization, I don't think there's quite the same kind of rivalry or tension or whatever between, say, North America and the church in Africa, that kind of thing.
No, because we weren't the primary colonizers in Africa.
Right.
I don't know how Africa relates to the French, for example, but we haven't had that history, so we're not burdened with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, the burden of history, we have a burden of history that's coming up in a few weeks here at the Conclave, and I really hope that you're keeping your cell phone number out there for the College of Cardinals so they can call you, Fran, when they get to a difficult point. They'll waive the rules. They'll bring you in and they'll say, Fran, we've got to get your advice on this. We're not sure which direction to go.
I think I can safely leave my phone off on that one. But I just hope that the next Pope recognizes the health of the Church in the United States and relies on the good in it in going forward, because there's a lot in the U.S. Catholic experience that can really contribute to the future of the Church globally in a good way. And I hope that they get an opportunity to access that.
Well, amen. We thank you for giving us some of your true confessions here with respect to the current state of the Church and your hopes for the future. I loved writing it.
And I hope people will I think people who read it will have a hopeful experience and understand the world a little bit more hopefully.
Well, I know I did when I read it as a manuscript. Again, there are some honest words about problems, but the overall effect of reading the book is to be very helpful and to see the positive directions in so many things in the Church. And that's what we're praying for with respect to the conclave and our next Pope. So thank you for being with us, Fran.
Oh, it was a delight. Always good seeing you, Mark.
Likewise.